Good evening, YouTube. Um, Today I'm going to share with you a little bit of my story. My story is one of how the generational curses of my elders led me into sex trafficking and how I survived it. I want to give you guys a little bit of information about myself because there's a few other topics that I want to address, but just so you have an idea where I come from. Okay, so my mother is the product. I'm going to even start with my grandmother. Okay. So my grandmother had one child. It was my mother. And she had that child with a married man. My grandfather was cheating on his wife with my grandmother, and they had my mother. Well, apparently situation didn't go the way that my grandmother wanted, and she was left a single mother. And apparently the rumor is my grandfather wanted to take my mother in, but his wife, told him if he did that, she was gone. It was an ultimatum. So my mother was left with my grandmother alone. And my grandmother was drinking at the time. Obviously, she wasn't living right as she was sleeping with the married man. And she was a heavy drinker, and who knows what else she was into. But she was very neglectful of my mother. She was very unloving towards my mother. And I think she may have taken out some of her resentment about what happened towards my mother. I know that things were said like my grandmother would tell my mom, I was never supposed to have children. I thought I couldn't have children and different things like that. So I would say for to some degree my mother was unloved. I would say that. And then my grandmother was neglectful of my mother, and my mom fell off of a fire escape at 9 years old. She fell from 9 stories, I believe, and cracked her skull, leaving her with severe brain damage. Okay. So my grandmother was probably having some house partying down, not watching her daughter in the city. And my mom fell off a fire escape and almost died. Well, when this happened, it was very strenuous recovery. My mom said she had to learn how to walk again, talk again, basically everything. And, it was obviously more than my grandmother wanted to deal with. So my mom was passed off to somebody, a woman. And apparently the woman did a decent job from what my mother told me along the years. And at some point, my mother was able to gain some degree of her capabilities. And she was coming back to my grandmother. They were living together. Apparently, as my mom was a teenager, at least 14 years old. I guess, who knows how long. Maybe it was a year or 2 years it took for her to recover from the fall. I know one thing. When my mom was recovering from the incident, my grandmother was not there. So my grandmother and my mother come back together, and my mother and grandmother were living in a 1-bedroom apartment, and she was still drinking, and this did not stop her from continuing her dating pursuits. So some kind of way, my grandmother hooked up with a man from Colombia, and she liked the guy apparently, and he came live with my mother and grandmother in the house. My mother was about 12, 13, 14 around this time. And after so long of time, my mother and the Colombian man started sleeping together. Okay. So my mother and the Colombian man are sleeping together. I don't know. Obviously, in my mind, being the person I am today, I'm looking at these people with disdain. Like, how does this go on? You're in a one bedroom flat, but apparently it did. So my mother and grandmother were sleeping with the same man, and my mother wound up pregnant, and it was a whole scandal. My grandmother tried to pretend that I was her and the guy's child. It's really, really sad what goes on in the community. I mean, we need to do better, people. But anyways, my mother's way of dealing with it, knowing the woman that I know and her ways that I know, she's a liar. And not only that, the brain damage. When a person gets brain damage, it makes them I'm sorry, excuse me for stuttering. It makes them susceptible to it's a way in for demons. It's a way in for demons. Excuse my stuttering. This is a lot for me to tell somebody. Okay. So I'm that child that was conceived in this, whatever they had going on in this debauchery. So when my mother's way of dealing with that, the guy was out of there. Some situation happened where charges were brought about. Apparently he did 6 months in jail, and my grandmother bonded him out of jail. Something about they were on the run. I don't know what happened, but my mother said she got me away from there. I don't even know if I can believe that. But what she told me growing up, at some point, I don't know the reason exactly, but the Colombian guy was gone. Not too long after I was born, not a year, not 2 years after I was born, maybe 1 to 2 years after I was born, he was gone. And my mother's way of dealing with this was to project her shame and guilt onto me and to tell me that I was a product of rape, which I wasn't. My mother was she was doing what she wanted to do for a power control. Probably some ways that my grandmother had taught her, because things my mother did to me let me know a lot about how she was treated. Okay. So hopefully I haven't confused you all too much. But basically, they had whoredoms going back. And then I came about, and my mom dumps all this sin and shame on me and guilt, telling me I'm the product of rape and I'm unlovable. From the time I was in the womb, I remember her projecting hatred and jealousy towards me. My mother's always been jealous of me, My father's Colombian, my mother's African American, and I'm a beautiful mixed woman with beautiful hair texture and a lovely golden complexion. And my mother is very insecure and wears weave. She has breast implants, and she's very jealous of me. She bought her breast implants with the money that she got from her fall off of the fire escape with the lawsuit and what came out of that. Well, I was raised in a lot of confusion. My people were not, although they were hypocritical, and they'll tell you on a face value, sure, we're Christian, we love the Lord, and as for his actions, no. And my mother, she was a straight out Satanist, demon. She was a devil worshiper, to be honest, and a witch. So I had a lot to deal with growing up, directing me and steering me in the wrong direction, and not to mention working against my life on a DNA level, in a spiritual level, certainly. as a youth. I remember from the time I was born, my mother used to speak whore over me and call me a little whore and the B word and out my name. From the time I was just a wee babe, okay? Pure jealousy. So, later, oh, well, just all the violations. I don't know if I should even share this, but I mean, it really, like I said, I'm a sex trafficking survivor and overcomer. And I can tell you a little bit about how I got there, just like some of these things that I've mentioned before. But also, I remember times, even so many times, but even going back 3 and 4 years old, my mother would tell me to go to bed, and then she would come into the bed I was supposed to be sleeping in and have sex. And this has happened many times. I can't tell you how many times before I was even in the single digit numbers that I see my mom have sex with many different men. And then my grandma enabled this. Somehow, her and my grandmother never, throughout my upbringing, my mother relied heavily on my grandmother to care for me. My grandmother was a great caregiver for me, and when I say great, I mean she did a great deal of the care. So my grandmother enabled my mother's whoredoms. My mother would always have different guys coming into the house. At 4 years old, I remember my mother renting cartoon pornography. Now, who does that when you have a 4-year-old child? But basically, I had no protection. No prayer protection, and everything possible going on in my life and done to me by my mother and enabled by my grandmother to direct me in the wrong direction. And my grandmother, I would come to my grandmother about confusing things like this, and my grandmother would never address my mother as being wrong. She would never say, oh, this is not right. It was always, that's your mother, and some other dumb stuff that I didn't understand, just creating confusion in my mind, cognitive dissonance, and making it very difficult for me to differentiate between right and wrong. But in the spirit, all of this is defiling me and probably making me a target. So, a lot more stuff happened. I don't want to get into, but you get the gist of it. This is me pre-kindergarten age, some of the things that my mother and grandmother were doing to lead me in the wrong direction. So let's just say, I don't know if I can get into all of everything, but maybe another time I'll do another story about some of the things leading up to me being into captivity and how I got out of captivity. After that, going to high school and even junior high, I believe they had marks on me, like spiritual marks, where a guy could just tell I had no love, and I really wanted to be liked. I really wanted attention. I needed a friend. I needed care. Just the love of Christ. Somebody give me the love that's owed to everyone, his neighbor, please. And I came to my classmates. I had a guy I liked, and of course I was mocked and ridiculed, and he humiliated me in every way. And I was an easy turnout, I would say. I was turned out. They mistreated me. I really wanted to get away from my home life. I wanted to get away from all the filth and degradation and the confusion I was seeing at home. So I would often in high school, I just wanted to be out the house. So I was beautiful. So, and I still am. If somebody's like, hey, do you want to come take a ride? Sure, I want to go. And I'm going, and now all of a sudden I'm under all this peer pressure. And I was very resistant at first. No, leave me alone. Take your hands off me. Stop. But I was the oldest girl, so I don't have any brothers coming after me to defend me, and I didn't have a father. And many times I was overpowered. But it was like this kind of addiction where I wanted to get out the house. A guy would invite me. I might get overpowered. Sometimes he might even these men sometimes would even, these are high school students that I went to school with, but sometimes they would even they'd run a train on me by violating my, ignoring my, I don't, stop, no, I don't want to do this. I was already in a situation where I was not confident, had no validation. I was told from an early age I had no self-worth, and actually a very poor sense of self-boundaries, because nobody ever taught me right from wrong. All I had was pretty much wrong growing up, in defilement growing up. So it was really, really hard for me to stand up for myself. And so I had got turned out in high school, where, the guy, basically, when I said that, I mean a bad reputation from having people run a train on me or something like that, because I didn't know how to defend myself, and I had no one to defend me. And my mother, I would say, as this time was going on in high school and after high school, I would say my mother, she never corrected my whoredom. She was whoring around herself. I had a stepdad, and he was working offshore, and she would have different guys come to the house. It was just, she never discondoned. Was I heavily abused and beaten and mistreated growing up? Sure. But she never discouraged any kind of exploits of whoredoms of any kind. That was one thing that the people where I come from, they stand behind their whoredoms 100%, and it's really, really sad. Um, so yeah, that's how it happened about. And I just wanted to get away from my family. I wanted to get away from my small town where my reputation had gotten ruined. And so I got into, me and a girlfriend of mine decided we wanted to be video vixens. So I had dated, in my small town, I knew a lot of our local rappers and whatnot, and I had dated someone, and they had connected me and my friend. We had some mutual connections with a record label producer, a guy with a record label over in Dallas, and we contacted him to see about getting in some music videos and how to be a video vixen. And we really hadn't experienced a whole lot about life. It was I didn't know anything about anything, and really my parents never invested any kind of information or truth or wealth or survival. I was not giving any tools for how to live. So, my hold on one second. I kind of lost my train of thought for a moment. Okay, so we tried to go off to be video vixens, and the producer, the record label person, told us, I only deal with strippers and prostitutes. I only deal with strippers and prostitutes. And, our self-esteem was so low, and we wanted out so bad. We said, well, we'll be strippers and prostitutes. How? And he was able to turn us out over the phone and get into our minds and convince us. And some kind of way, each one of me and my friends, the Greyhound bus ticket was $157 to Dallas, and we each some kind of way gathered up our $157. My friend was working at the mall, and she slept with her manager's husband. And me, my mom is so ratchet, I just straight up told my mom, because I've always been a woman of truth, and I've always lived in the truth. And I told my mom I was going off to become a prostitute. And she actually got me my first client, and it was the worst client I have ever had in my life. She set me up with some guy, and she let us use her van. And on that encounter, I thought it was just going to be a regular encounter, but I was sodomized without my permission. And it was very painful and traumatic. And I remember leaving a stain on the back seat of that van. And that's just a little reminder to myself of, what happened to me was real. And also the fact that my mom, she had set me up with that man, and I believe she did that on purpose. But I would not give her the satisfaction. I was hurt and I was in shock. It was a lot going on because I had never done anything like that before, and nor did anything like that ever happen to me again. It was one of the worst encounters I've ever had, actually. But, I believe my mother did that to traumatize me, and also perhaps to discourage me and to keep me from going into that life, but also as an act of cruelty. So there was a lot of times where, some people would say, "Hey, I've just been raped," or some guy took something from me, but I kept it together and I didn't say anything to her. I didn't say anything. I came to my friend, and me and her, I went in the bathroom, I told my friend what happened, and a few days later me and her were gone. But I would have said, "Oh, my mother did that to me because I told her I was going to be a prostitute." But I can attest to you, I'm the oldest of four siblings, and also she made sure that my other three siblings were also sexually molested or assaulted throughout our childhood as well. That was